Julian Barnes with the Wall Street Journal. Mr. Secretary General, we've got some talks between North and South Korea and potential upcoming talks between the United States and North Korea. I wonder what your view of this is. Do you view the offers from North Korea about halting testing as legitimate, something that can be counted on? Should we view any proposal to reduce the U.S. presence in the Korean Peninsula as destabilizing? What's your view of that?
I visited the region last fall, and I really sensed the tension in the region, especially when I visited the demilitarized zone. Therefore, I welcome the Inter-Korean Summit. I think that's very encouraging. And I think it is a first important step towards a negotiated peaceful solution to the crisis on the Korean Peninsula. I also welcome the announcement by North Korea to stop testing nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. And I think it is important that we continue to support all efforts to find a political solution. I think that one of the reasons why we see the progress we have seen over the last weeks is because there has been strong pressure there has been strong pressure on North Korea, not least by the sanctions that the UN has adopted. And I welcome both that the UN has been able to agree on stricter sanctions on North Korea, but also that we have seen that they have been implemented to a higher degree than before. Until we see concrete changes in North Korea's actions, we must continue to put pressure on North Korea and to continue with the sanctions.
We'll go to the second row. Gentleman there with glasses.
Ekaterina Mareeva, Kommersant Daily newspaper. Hungary once again blocked Ukraine NATO Commission because of newly adopted education law. What has to be done in order to resolve this conflict? Thank you.
Hungary is a valued NATO ally which contributes to NATO's collective defense in many different ways, and we are grateful for that. Ukraine is a close partner, and for NATO it is important to continue to provide strong political and practical support to Ukraine, not least because the aggressive action by Russia against Ukraine, illegally annexing Crimea and destabilizing eastern Ukraine, is one of the main reasons why NATO since 2014 has implemented the biggest reinforcement of our collective defense. So Ukraine is an important partner for NATO. It is correct that we have not been able to convene NATO-Ukraine Commission meetings at the ministerial level because Hungary is blocking that because they disagree with Ukraine on the question of a language law. It is for Ukraine and Hungary to solve their disagreements about the rights for minorities, and I count on them to solve these disagreements quickly. We have been able to convene meetings in the NATO-Ukraine Commission at the ambassadorial level, but there is strong support in the alliance to also convene a NATO-Ukraine Commission meeting at ministerial level, and therefore it is important to see that Hungary and Ukraine is able to solve these disagreements as soon as possible.
Okay. Agence France Presse in the third row.
Hi, Damon Wake from AFP, Agence France Presse. On Iraq, how do you foresee overcoming some of the forced generation issues that have been associated with the Afghan mission, avoid them being repeated in Iraq? And on Afghanistan, given the two elections they have coming up, the parliamentary later this year and the presidential next year, could there be any role for NATO in providing security for these elections, or is that something that you would rule out at this stage? Thanks.
You asked me about elections in Afghanistan or in Iraq?
Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan. Well, we provide strong support to the Afghan National Security Forces, and they are responsible for security in Afghanistan themselves. I think actually that's one of the great achievements we have been able to make in Afghanistan, is that not so many years ago, NATO was responsible for countering the Taliban when they attacked the different terrorist groups. And then in 2015, we were able to hand over responsibility for security in Afghanistan to the Afghans themselves. So our main contribution, also to make sure that the elections can be held in a safe and secure way, is to continue to provide support to the Afghan security forces, with training, with advice, and also with funding. Having said that, I also envisage a limited role for NATO forces to help to make sure that the elections can be held in a safe way.
Okay, we go to the front row here.
Barzan Hassan, Kurdistan 24. Secretary General, you have been visit Iraq just 1 month ago. And as you know, there are many international allies in Erbil, Iraqi Kurdistan. And your ally training Peshmerga forces. Why you don't have any training in Erbil, Iraqi Kurdistan? Thank you.
So many NATO allies provide training for the Peshmerga in Erbil, and this is something which shows that many NATO allies are very committed to provide training and support. The training mission NATO is now planning to launch and to scale up our training in Iraq. That's about training the Iraqi forces. Whether we will go further later on, it's too early to say. We will start with the training mission. The current assumption is in the range of some hundreds. But I think it's important to understand that what we will do is to train the trainers, is to help Iraq help themselves, or Iraqis help themselves. So we will help build military schools and train Iraqi instructors so they can train thousands. This is about building the capacity of Iraq to train their own soldiers.
Mitra TV, first row.
Mr. Secretary General, you just mentioned about Afghanistan and about the peace and reconciliation process, but the Taliban just launched their spring offensives. They announced it yesterday. Are we expecting, shall we be expecting any new decisions in this meeting on Afghanistan in this regard? Thank you.
First, I would like to highlight how strongly NATO allies and NATO welcome the peace initiative by President Ghani. He has invited Taliban without conditions to sit down at the negotiating table and to find a political solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. I think we all should welcome that because there is only a political negotiated solution to the conflict in Afghanistan. At the same time, I think it's important to understand that there is a close link between what can happen around the negotiating table and what is happening on the battlefield. Because that's the reason why NATO continues to provide military support, both political but also military support to Afghanistan. Because Taliban has to understand that they will never win at the battlefield. We will continue to train, to advise and support the Afghan National Security Forces. And that will create the framework, the conditions for the Taliban to, at some stage, sit down and negotiate for a peaceful solution. Afghanistan will be an important issue at the summit in July. There will be a meeting of the Rescue Support Partners, meaning the 39 partners in the Rescue Support Mission, with also Afghanistan present. And I expect their heads of state and government to reconfirmed their strong commitment and support of Afghanistan, including the training and assisting, advising the Afghan forces, and also addressing the issue of funding for them, which is of course of great importance.
NPR Deutsche Welle in the fourth row.
Hi, Terry Schultz with NPR and Deutsche Welle, thanks. How would you characterize the sort of feeling of discussion now with the Russians? You've had the Gerasimov Scaparrotti meeting, but you've also had the Skripal poisoning, the Syrian bombing, and the kicking out of diplomats. And what are the possibilities of having an NRC before the summit?
We are working for a new meeting of the NATO-Russia Council. We continue to strive for a meaningful dialogue with Russia, and we believe that especially when times are difficult, especially when tensions are high, as there are now in light of the Skripal case, the attack in Salisbury, the repeated examples we have seen of Russian attempts to interfere in domestic political processes, cyber attacks, and also the continued destabilization of eastern Ukraine, support for the Assad regime. All of that has created a situation where tensions are higher and the relationship between NATO and Russia is more difficult than it's been for many years. But that's not an argument against dialogue. That's actually an argument in favor of dialogue, partly to continue to strive for a better relationship, but even without any, as I say, improvement in the relationship, it is important to manage the relationship we have with Russia, because we need to manage a situation where we have more military presence, more exercises, and to prevent incidents and accidents. And that's exactly also why it is important that our Supreme Allied Commander for Europe and General Gerasimov met, and they addressed issues like, for instance, so military posture and exercises. So we will continue to work for dialogue, and military lines of communications is part of that.
James?
Yeah, as I said, we are working for a new, no date is fixed, but we are working for a new meeting.
James in the fourth row.
Yes, Brooks Senior, Jane's Defense. The Vice Speaker of Ukraine's Rada just a couple of days ago here said effectively the Minsk talks are dead and that diplomacy with Russia will serve nothing regarding the Donbass. And importantly, that the only way to reassert Ukraine's full sovereignty is to erect the strongest possible army for the country. Two questions for you. Do you agree with those assessments? And secondly, is there anything NATO should do to shore up the Ukrainian army beyond the trust funds it already has? Don't want to talk about that. And such as a training mission in Ukraine or pressuring the allies to step up their bilateral military aid to the country. Thank you.
NATO allies provide strong support to Ukraine, and partly they do that through NATO and NATO activities, and we have a substantial cooperation with Ukraine through different programs, through different trust funds. We help them with command control, with logistics, with cyber defenses, and not least we help them to implement reforms to strengthen their security and military institutions, and also to fight corruption. All of this is extremely important if Ukraine is going to succeed in modernizing and strengthening their armed forces. Then NATO allies also provide support bilaterally, and I welcome that. When I travel to different NATO capitals, I urge them to continue to provide and also to strengthen their support for Ukraine, both through bilateral efforts and also in the NATO framework. So NATO allies will continue, and we will look for ways to increase our support. And I think for Ukraine, it's not so extremely important whether this support is done in the NATO framework or by NATO allies on the bilateral level. The important thing is that the support is there, and we will continue to urge the NATO allies to provide more support. I agree that we have seen a lack of implementation, but I also think that Minsk is the only platform we have to try to find a peaceful and negotiated solution. So we need to continue to work for a peaceful negotiated solution and not least the implementation of that at the same time as we provide support to Ukraine, and we will continue to do both.
All the way to the back, Financial Times. Back. There you go.
Thank you. Michael Peel, Financial Times. Iran is obviously very much in the news at the moment. What is the NATO position on the Iran nuclear deal? Is it helpful or not? And also, ballistic missiles are also a big topic of discussion. What is the position in NATO on Iran's missile program? What concerns does it have, given that both the debate over the missiles and the nuclear program could affect NATO operations in the surrounding region, and indeed, in the case of missiles, possibly even NATO member states? Thank you.
So NATO welcomed the Iran nuclear deal when it was agreed in 2015. At the same time, we underlined the importance of full implementation of the deal. And we believe that we welcomed the deal back in 2015 because it helps to move Iran further away from developing nuclear weapons. And this is, of course, important for the security of NATO allies because nuclear weapons in Iran combined with ballistic missiles will be a direct threat to NATO allies. At the same time, it's obvious that no deal can be good without being fully respected and fully implemented. And it is also clear that there are other issues which are not covered by the deal. For instance, Iran's ballistic missile program, which is a cause for great concern, and also the efforts of Iran to destabilize the region, support to different terrorist groups, and also the threat to freedom of maritime navigation. So we are concerned both about the Iranian missile program, but also other activities of Iran in the region. NATO is in the process of gradually strengthening our missile defenses. I visited a site in Romania when we inaugurated that. We are working on a new site in Poland. We have a radar in Turkey. We have ships, Aegis ships in Rota. So we have step by step continued to strengthen our missile defenses. So that's also part of the response to the threat of ballistic missiles.
Sorry, just a quick follow-up. Given what you've said, do you think the US demand for a supplemental agreement of European powers and the threats to withdraw from the agreement, if that isn't forthcoming, is helpful?
I think it's important to address those concerns which are not covered by the deal. For instance, the missile program. This has created great concern among NATO allies, and I welcome all efforts to address the Iranian missile program. And I think it's also important to address other activities by Iran, for instance, their destabilizing activities and their support for extremist groups. These are elements, these are challenges, threats, which are not covered by the Iran nuclear deal. We welcome the nuclear deal because it helped to move Iran further away from developing nuclear weapons. But at the same time, no deal will be effective, no deal will be good if it's not fully implemented. Well, that's not for NATO to assess. We have the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is the agency that is assessing that, because NATO is not directly part of the deal. So we welcome the deal, and we agree that it is important to address also other threats, like, for instance, the missile program.
Question in the front row.
Jovana Đurišić, Pobjeda Daily. In one of your recently statement, you said that you are too focused on Syria, Iraq, that you forgot Western Balkan countries. And you added that there are some developments here which are really going in wrong direction. Which developments and which wrong direction you had in mind, and how NATO member countries from region can prevent these wrong directions?
My message is that it is important, of course, to be focused on the threats that emanates from, for instance, the Middle East, Syria and Iraq. But it is important to do that and at the same time not forget about the challenges which we see even closer to NATO territory in the Western Balkans. Actually, both Iraq and Syria and Western Balkans are close to NATO because Iraq and Syria is bordering a NATO ally, Turkey, and the Western Balkans are bordering several NATO allies. So I'm only saying that we need to do both things at the same time. They are two very different regions, but we have to stay focused on both of them. The Western Balkan is at the heart of Europe. NATO has a history there. We helped to end 2 wars there in the 1990s, and NATO still have a presence in the Western Balkans. We have a presence in Kosovo with our KFOR mission there, several thousand soldiers. We have headquarters presence in Skopje and in Sarajevo. We help partners with reforms, with capacity building. And of course, we also have several members in the Western Balkans. The latest member of the alliance, Montenegro, is from the region. We have also partners like, for instance, Serbia, and we have 2 aspirant countries, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia and Bosnia-Herzegovina. So NATO has a lot of partners, members, activities in the Western Balkans. We continue to work with them to prevent any escalation of tensions, because we have seen before how dangerous that can be, and we work with our members and we work with our partners to help to avoid any escalation of the tensions in the region.
Okay, we go to the second row.
Tanya Milevska, Macedonia News Agency. Secretary General, the Russian ambassador twice has said in Macedonia that if the country becomes a NATO member, it will, and I'm quoting here, it becomes a legitimate target for Russia in case of conflict with NATO countries. So I would really like your comment on this. And secondly, have you been briefed recently on the state of play with the negotiations on the name issue with Greece? Thank you.
First, I think it is extremely important to underline the right of any nation to decide its own path. This is a fundamental, including what kind of security arrangements it wants to be part of. And this is a fundamental principle which is important for NATO, but also Russia has subscribed to that, for instance, in different international documents, agreements, starting with the Helsinki Fine Act back in '74, and since then also in other documents. So I think for Skopje to decide its own path, it's for them to decide, and whether it joins NATO or not is for the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia and 29 NATO allies to decide. No one else has the right to veto or to have a say in that process. The whole idea of that Russia will not accept that some other countries join NATO is in a way an expression of the idea to establish some spheres of influence where big powers control small neighbors. And that is contradicting everything NATO believes in, and that's the independent and sovereign right of all nations to decide their own path. When it comes to the name issue, that was one issue I discussed when I met with Prime Minister Zoran Zaev in Skopje not so many weeks ago. We had good discussions on that. I also spoke with Prime Minister Tsipras, and I welcome and I hope that the dialogue which is now taking place between Athens and Skopje can lead to a solution, a mutual acceptable solution to the name issue. because then we are ready to invite Faroum to become a member of the alliance. We agreed that back in 2008, and that decision still stands.
Okay, gentleman in the first row here. In the first row, please.
Robert Lupițu, Cal Europeană, Romania Media. Mr. Secretary General, given the fact that this will be the last foreign ministerial meeting before the NATO summit in July, what decisions should be expected to further deterrence the entire eastern flank of the alliance? Thank you.
NATO has significantly strengthened our deterrence and defense since 2014 with enhanced forward presence in the Baltic countries and Poland, with also increased military presence in the southeast of the alliance, in the Black Sea region. We have increased our readiness, our ability to reinforce if needed, and we have strengthened capabilities as cyber defense, but also our maritime posture, air policing, and we are doing many different things to continue to provide credible deterrence and defense. We will, of course, continue to assess what more is needed, and I expect that heads of state and government will look into the need to further strengthen our capabilities when it comes to reinforcement, to be able to reinforce, to deploy forces quickly if needed, and that includes also the issue of military mobility throughout Europe, but also to be able to deliver supplies, equipment, move forces across the North Atlantic. What kind of decisions, I think it's a bit too early to announce, but these are the issues we will look into: reinforcements and military mobility. Yeah.
Okay, we have the gentleman in the second row.
TRT News from Turkey. Mr. Secretary General, some NATO members criticized Turkey for purchasing S-400 air defense system from NATO, although we didn't see the similar reaction when Greece bought S-300s from Russia in 1990s. What is the reason for that, and will NATO provide other air defense systems to Turkey in the future? Thank you.
It's a national decision what kind of military capabilities different NATO allies acquire. At the same time, we have seen that some allies have expressed concerns, and also we have seen that recently from the United States. Therefore, I welcome that there is now direct contact between the United States and Turkey on this issue. It was also an issue I discussed with President Erdogan when I visited Ankara recently. And I also welcome the fact that Turkey is now in dialogue both with the United States to look into the possibility of acquiring a US system, Patriot batteries, but also that they have agreed to work with the Italian-French group Eurosam to see if that's a platform, if that's a possibility to deliver an air defense system from Italy and France. So I welcome these efforts to also look into the possibility of acquiring air defense systems from NATO allies.
Lady over there. Third row. Third row.
Thank you, Rusa Shelia from Georgian newspaper Quiris Balitra. Mr. Secretary General, what you can say about Georgia's perspectives, and do you think that Georgia needs more support from NATO, because even Russian propaganda and military activities is getting more and more aggressive in my country?
Well, Georgia is a very close partner of NATO, and we have many different activities. We provide practical and political support to Georgia, and we also welcome that Georgia is making progress towards a membership, and I'm certain that the summit will recognize this progress. We also welcome the fact that we have many different tools to strengthen our partnership. We have the Joint Training and Evaluation Center, We have NATO support for different other educational efforts by Georgia to strengthen and to improve the quality of their armed forces. We help them with implementing reforms. So there is a lot of NATO presence and there are several exercises. But I would also like to stress that NATO is very appreciate strongly also that Georgia is contributing to NATO missions and operations. So this is not only NATO providing support to Georgia, but also very much that Georgia provides a lot of support to NATO, not least by being one of the nations providing the highest number of forces to our rescue support mission in Afghanistan.
Okay, we have Agence France Presse at the very back. No, on the other side.
Désolé, je vais vous poser cette question en français. Je voudrais revenir sur l'Iran. Vous semblez avoir pris un peu position. Les États-Unis veulent remettre en question l'accord sur l'Iran. Les alliés européens sont contre, disent que l'accord est bon, qu'il est mis en application, que sa mise en œuvre a été certifiée par l'AIEA. Est-ce que vous ne risquez pas d'avoir demain, au cours de la réunion entre les ministres, une sérieuse divergence, voire un affrontement entre deux parties des alliés, et surtout si c'est M. Pompeo qui vient représenter les États-Unis?
Well, it's too early to say exactly who will represent the United States because it remains to be seen how far they will come when it comes to the confirmation in the Senate. But I look forward to welcome the representative of the United States, regardless of whether it's the new Secretary of State or whether it's someone else. The beginning of the question was about Iran. Yes, and the challenge there is that, of course, we are concerned about different activities which we see Iran is responsible for, including their ballistic missile program, their support for extremist groups, and also their efforts to destabilize countries in the region. And that's exactly why I expect NATO ministers, foreign ministers, to address the issue of the Iran nuclear deal, and that will be a topic that will be addressed and discussed during the foreign ministerial meeting that starts tomorrow. I think it's a bit too early to report from the discussion because the meeting will take place tomorrow, but this is an issue which is important for all NATO allies because it affects our security.
Okay, gentleman in the front row.
Kim Kosmachev, Delphi, Latvia. Mr. Secretary General, first question is, does NATO have any plans to enhance the presence of allied forces in the Baltic countries, maybe in the future? And what is the NATO position on the dealing of so-called Russian threat in the Baltic region?
NATO has increased significantly our presence in the Baltic region. For the first time, NATO has troops in the region with 4 battle groups in the 3 Baltic countries and in Poland. We also have air policing and we have more maritime presence in the Baltic Sea. Then I think and this sends a clear message to any potential adversary because these forces, the battle groups we have in the Baltic countries and Poland, they are multinational. They are led by the United States, by the United Kingdom, by Germany, and by Canada. And there are many other NATO allies providing troops. So the importance of the presence of the NATO battle groups in the Baltic region is part, of course, the size, the quality of these troops, but also the message they send by being multinational, sending a clear message that NATO is there and that any aggression against any of these countries will trigger the response from the whole NATO alliance. Therefore, our focus now is on how to be sure that we can continue to reinforce, if needed, these countries. And that's exactly what we are working on. Both when it comes to what we call military mobility, able to reinforce, to enable our forces and the territory we are responsible for, and also to actually bring forces across the Atlantic if there is a real need for strengthening NATO's military presence in Europe. This is on the agenda. We are working on it, and then we will. Then things too early to announce any specific decisions, but the issue of reinforcement is high on the NATO agenda.
Thank you very much. This concludes this press conference. Looking forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you.